Hello and welcome to the Basis Point Insight interview. Today we turn the spotlight on an issue that often operates behind the scenes but plays a very critical role in shaping India's growth story: the legal and regulatory frameworks that support business, investment, and innovation. The finance minister had recently said something that stayed with many of us, that India's regulators need to be more agile if we want to keep attracting investments. We've heard this before in policy circles, investor meetings, and boardrooms. But coming from the very top, it sends a clear signal that this conversation is gaining momentum. As India sets its sights on becoming Viksit Bharat, a developed, inclusive, and sustainable economy by 2047, the role of strong institutions, predictable laws, and responsive regulation becomes even more central. These are foundational to long term growth, investor confidence, and public trust. To help us explore how all of this fits together, from legal reform and corporate governance to the rule of law and the critical issue of energy transition, we're joined by someone uniquely positioned to offer perspective. Akshay Jaitly is here with us today. He co founded Trilegal, one of India's top law firms, and also TrustBridge, a research initiative focused on strengthening the legal foundations of business, with a particular attention to how legal systems can support India's energy and climate goals. Akshay, thank you for being with us here. It's a pleasure to have you here.
My pleasure, Ranjana. Thanks a lot for having me.
So, Akshay, you've had a unique vantage point from building a top tier law firm to working on systemic legal reform. When we talk about India's 2047 growth vision, what is the role that legal and institutional frameworks play in helping us get there?
I think, Ranjana, legal and institutional frameworks, as you put it, are absolutely key and central to the manner in which we build the structures that will take us to the goals that we've set for ourselves. I think that very often when people look at the idea of ease of doing business, which is shorthand for many things and actually means different things to different people somehow, I think that what we should be thinking about is to clean the pipes, the broad pipes on which the economy runs. And the economy runs on the basis fundamentally, or should run fundamentally, on the basis of the rule of law. And what that means is predictability, it means fairness, and it means that swift and equal enforcement of the law for every participant in the economy. And not, to my mind, to making a few rules or a few systems or a few processes slightly easier for, say, investment in a particular sector. So, to give you an example, to say that if we want more investment in the infrastructure sector, to say that setting up a single window for certain clearances is the way forward. Now, that could be helpful in some ways, but perhaps the bigger and broader and more meaningful questions to ask is, why is that investment not coming in the first place? Or why is sufficient investment not coming in the first place? Because clearly we've seen a lot of infrastructure development in the last 15, 20 years. Now, the answers to those sorts of questions are slightly harder. And they are based on things like enforcement of contract, the fair functioning of regulators, the confidence and predictability of the system as a whole, which are the kinds of things that when I'm acting as a lawyer on behalf of clients, whether Indian or overseas, those are the kinds of risks and problems that people are very, very keen to address when contemplating an investment. And when I'm putting on my researcher's hat, those are the kinds of questions we try and answer. Why, for instance, do regulators not function as effectively as they could? And very often those problems are not so much to do with superficial matters, but some fundamental issues in the manner in which regulators are structured, the way that the incentive systems around these institutions are placed.
Yeah. So, which is the one area where you think regulation is choking progress, and maybe another where it is required but it is absent?
I think that the way that we should think of regulation is very often regulation is a way to address the specific issues that come in a particular sector. So you have specialized regulators in a whole lot of sectors, and in areas such as capital markets, etc. People like SEBI who come in to regulate matters which where a lot of technical competence is required, but where also at the same time you need to uphold the fundamental principles of the rule of law. So I think that the tricky part for us is to make sure that the people who we have within those regulatory institutions, the member level, the senior people, have both those sets of skills in adequate amount. So you need to know how deeply how the sector operates, what are market practices, what are standard ways of functioning, and at the same time, how how the principles of the basic principles of the rule of law should apply to the manner in which these institutions function.
Yeah, as I said earlier, we had the Finance Minister Sitharaman call for more regulatory agility to attract investments. And we keep hearing of the term regulatory cholesterol, the accumulated layers that slowing down growth. So, do you see this as a core challenge today?
I think there are those are two separate things. I think this is Manish Sabarwal's favorite term, regulatory cholesterol, which
Hmm.
I really think beautifully describes what we face. I think regulatory cholesterol is the layers of regulation and the kinds of the burden of compliance that is placed upon Indian business. And it's important, I think, in this context to have a mental picture of Indian business which reflects the reality. Now, when we think of an Indian company, we think of the very big names that dominate our industrial landscape and people who are listed on the stock exchange, etc. But an Indian company is also a small publishing house. It could be a restaurant. It could be a small manufacturing unit. And in fact, the burden of regulatory cholesterol is felt most by those smaller businesses, which don't necessarily have the time and space and headspace and money to be able to fulfill the requirements of regulation, which I think were both put up at a or put in at a time when we ran a much more regulated socialist economy, and we haven't fully sort of unwound that. And also because we didn't necessarily think about those small businesses when we put those in place. So I think that's the regulatory cholesterol point. The regulatory agility, I think, is the responsiveness of a regulator to the kinds of questions that is coming in front of us, given whatever the actual regulatory architecture might be. So, for instance, so one of the big problems that we encounter over here is that very important regulators sometimes remain understaffed, and positions even at the member level aren't fulfilled in time. That's a very obvious problem that is very easily identified because everyone knows who the members of those things of those organizations are. But below that, what the public does not get to see are the secretariats or the staff of these organizations. And very often it's extremely unrealistic to think that two or three members are going to be able to deliver verdicts on important regulatory issues in a shorter or a relatively shorter, sensible time frame if they don't have both the right numbers and the rightly qualified staff sitting beneath them who are feeding them with all the information, the analysis to enable them to make those decisions in the first place. So we both need, I think, less regulation, and regulation should be aimed towards specific problems and solving for specific market failures on the one hand. And on the other hand, we need to have far better organized and staffed and resourced regulators at the same time. So we need less regulation in terms of the actual regulations themselves and more regulation in terms of the power and depth and knowledge of the regulators.
Um, Going to the other side, we place the burden of reform on governments as it should be. But what about businesses themselves? As India grows, what does responsible corporate behavior look like? We're talking about the big businesses, especially when it comes to climate action, ethical conduct, investing in long-term institutional health?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid question, but I think there is a bit of chicken and egg that happens over here. I think that because the regulatory burden is heavy, and at the same time, there's a reasonable amount of discretion that exists within the state to that it can accord to various different types of businesses. There are certain types of players who have the wherewithal to deal with that discretion and to deal with the ambiguity that exists within the system. I think if there was more predictability and less ambiguity and more clarity for an average smaller business of the kind I was describing earlier, I think you'd see much more ethical behavior. If someone running a business today was certain that if they followed the law they would not be harassed, then they would set up a business and follow the law. So there is one favorite example that many people have given in the past, which is that of, I don't know whether it still exists or not, but it did in the past, of the sort of regulatory burden on a restaurant in Bombay. So there's one law in Bombay which says that which comes from the excise side, which says that a restaurant can only have one entrance because they want to control the alcohol coming in and out of the restaurant. At the same time, fire regulations require
Yeah.
that there be at least two entrances. Now, the business is going to be in violation of one of those two laws. And that gives the leeway to the person coming to enforce the law at your doorstep to sort of, make it difficult for you to run your business. So this is just a small example, but there are thousands of these sorts of examples that dot our legal and regulatory landscape. And in fact, there was this ORF Teamly study that came out a couple of years ago that identified 26,000 laws for which a business person or someone working in a position of responsibility in a business could be sent to jail. Now, there are certain people who can deal with that sort of risk, and there are other people who just don't want to. So there are probably a few 100,000 people all around India who would start a business but are not doing so because the risk of compliance is too heavy.
Yeah. So now India's economic growth and coming to climate commitments, this brings us to the critical topic of energy transition. So you've done extensive work in this field. How do legal and regulatory frameworks support or hinder India's move towards cleaner energy sources?
I think that's a great question, and I think there are just as in other areas of the economy, there are two ways that the government can, two broad principles that the government could follow in order to promote some of the kinds of investments that would support India's energy transition. The first of those is, the right kinds of incentives within the system for people to quote unquote do the right thing. And the second is to get out of the way wherever possible. So I think just as in any other form of regulation, a good principle to follow is identify the market failures that exist in that particular market or in that sector, and regulate strongly for those market failures to prevent them from happening. And for instance, the protection of an electricity consumer, because electricity, which is an important aspect of the energy transition, is inherently monopolistic. You need to protect the consumer from the potential monopolistic behavior of one incumbent, and that's a very fair use of regulation. On the other hand, I think we have too much regulation on what people can and can't do. My favorite example here is to say, if you are my neighbor and you put up a solar panel on your roof and you have some extra supply that you can't use, and I want to buy it off you, and you want to run a cable safely following all standards necessary to my house and sell me that electricity, why should anyone bother if you're selling that to me at 100 rupees a unit or 10 rupees a unit? Because it's a transaction between a willing buyer and a willing seller. Now, I think for the energy transition, transactions between willing buyers and willing sellers is what the regulatory landscape should promote. And what it should control for is the potential market failures, which in this sector could be, as I said, monopolistic behavior. It could be standards not being followed, leading to safety problems. It could be grid stability because too many people are supplying into or pulling from the grid at the same time. So you can identify a short list of market failures and then set up a highly qualified, well performing regulatory framework to deal with those, while at the same time letting people do the deals that they want to do because they feel free, that they feel that they want to do. So I think that's the way that we could do it. And I think that some incentives are probably needed in sectors in which which might be a little slow to take off because the perception is that the inherent initial risk is too high. But in general, I think the operating principle should be quite simple, old-fashioned economics, regulatory economics, which is regulate for market failure and otherwise let it.
Looking at the complex challenges that we face in India, what do you think should be the top priorities for policymakers, the businesses, and citizens alike in the next decade or so?
Oh, that's a
Big one.
that's a big one and probably a few levels above my pay grade. But I think that look, what we have to first all agree, and I think we do, that we have enormous potential. And in the year 2000, the Economist came out with its Millennium Edition, and it had a short paragraph on the future prospects as it saw then of each country. And on India, it had the headline was it stuck in my head very strongly, and it said Indians do better than India. Now, if you look around the world, we all know about and are extremely proud of the performance of many of our business leaders and others around the world. And and we talk about how well they do. Now we are a clever people, we are a resourceful people, we are innovative, we are used to frugal innovation, making do with the best that we have. I think that the best thing the government should be looking for, and to be fair, the Prime Minister said this when he first came into power, which was a minimum government, maximum governance. I think that minimum government part is something that we need to place a little closer attention on. I think maximum governance, the government sort of there's been a lot of enforcement, a lot of compliance, a lot of dealing with allegations of corruption. That's a good thing. But I think the minimum government part has been somewhat overlooked. And it is again the government stepping out of the way in as many areas as it can. And there's an important question of attitude over here. I think a lot of the way the Indian state functions, and this is not necessarily an edict that comes from the top, but it is the sort of muscular reflex of years of working in a certain type of system. I think the instinctive response of someone in a position of power, whether a regulator or in the state itself, is to say someone must be doing something wrong, so I have to find a way to prevent them from doing something wrong. And what that tends to do is create a legal and regulatory architecture that where the entry conditions and the compliance conditions are very heavy, as opposed to taking the opposite views to say, I'm going to allow maximum freedom with a short set of rules which really cover the things that matter and enforce them very strictly. Because it's sort of, we don't really have the institutional state capacity to actually enforce all the laws that we have on the books. So what that means is that a lot of people will try and break the law and deal with the consequences of it at the time. So instead of that, if we had far fewer laws and far less compliance, but really focus on those that are important and enforce them strictly and credibly, then you'll get, as you were saying earlier, the better behavior from the private sector, and you'll get more effective enforcement. So I think that balance between governance and government needs to be restruck quite fundamentally, and that requires a change of mind shift, not just at the top, but in throughout all arms of the government, and very importantly in all the states of the country.
Uh, this brings us to the end of a very short interview with you, Akshay. Really appreciate your time and insights. And
Not at all.
And so, what's actually clear from our conversation is that our growth story isn't just about numbers or bold visions, mantras. It's about the nuts and the bolts, how predictable our laws are, how agile our regulators are, how seriously businesses take their wider responsibilities. Even if that chicken and egg situation is there, so, if we want to reach our goal, our growth goals, we can't just chase capital. We have to earn trust, build institutions that outlast governments, and create a rule of law that supports innovation without stifling it, right? The road to developed India runs right through its legal and regulatory frameworks. And I guess we have a lot of work at hand.
Yes, but it's very exciting work, and the goal is a very positive and good one. So I think we should feel positive about that, roll our sleeves up, and get to work.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Akshay. It was a pleasure having you here.
My pleasure, Ranjana. Thanks a lot. Thanks for calling me.